Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Ben Wheeler, and today I'm here with my co host, Anthony Marquetta. I'm double fisting today, and I must apologize to our listeners. We had expected to have a Kickstarter announcement, but I messed up because I forgot that Kickstarter has a wait. So I just planned on getting it done yesterday, and it didn't happen. Uh, but so what we're going to talk about is something that we have talked about before, uh, and that is namely church. How do I want to put this? Like church, it's church authority, but in the sense of how does the authority of the church migrate from thing to thing? Uh, so of course, what puts us into mind is that there is a new pope, Pope Leo the 14th, from Cardinal, was it Prevost? I think.
Yes, Cardinal
Uh,
Robert Prevost. Lots of fun things coming out. Like his brother is still alive, which is
yeah.
wild. Like, and he's done interviews. He's like, "Yeah, we were playing Wordle, and now he's the Pope."
It's very funny because he's uh, red pilled on some things, um, which is it's amusing in its own way. He's very pro Nixon, uh, which I thought was funny. He's been putting out a lot of boomer memes. I guess I'll say. Oh, Nixon went away for 30 seconds of destroyed tape, but Nancy Pelosi can delete her servers. It's very amusing to watch. Uh,
I mean, there's like stuff coming out. Like, there's a video that just went out that was like, "Here's the Pope at the World Series in 2005 at a Chicago White Sox game," and it's you don't really think of popes having brothers even. Normally, like, they're so
right.
old, most of their family dies. But his brother's just some American dude, and it's like I think Ed Fazer put it, can't believe that the pope is a dude from Chicago named Bob.
It's pretty great. I'm enjoying this cycle. I'm already seeing both sides of this Pope is the most Jew loving, Israel supporting Pope that's ever been, blah, blah, blah. And then to this is the most right wing Pope that's ever been, blah, blah, blah. And it's,
Yeah,
it's, there, like, you
it's
have to understand, it's entertaining to me, but it isn't entertaining to the Catholics.
oh, it's entertaining, just not in the same way. Like, here's the thing. Yeah, I do find like dude's a Marxist, evil Marxist, like just Francis clone. I do find that sort of thing to be fairly annoying. The thing about Leo the 14th is that in reality he is very young for a pope at 69. I think John Paul II was even younger. He was like 59, but he was elected in weird circumstances because John Paul II had died after like a month. Um, so the thing about this pope, like, I think with if you are a conservative leaning, traditionalist leaning Catholic, I don't think you really have much cause to complain. And this is why. The real conservative candidates, I know, everybody knew they were not going to win. Cardinal Burke, for example, who Caitlin's in chat. Hi, Caitlin. Who Caitlin and I have met. He was not going to win. Right? Like, he simply was not. He was too oppositional to people who are in the Vatican, to too many cardinals, right? Cardinal Sarah, who's like everybody's favorite based African cardinal, he was never going to win, right? Like,
No.
as much as it would honestly have been really great if he did. Even Pizzaballa was like billed as somewhat of a compromise candidate, but was also like the fact that he was so popular among conservatives was a good, clear sign that he was not going to win, right?
Yes.
So, what do you get with Prevost? Well, he's considered a compromise candidate, right? Like, the fact that he's a compromise candidate, I think if you are conservative, this is a good thing. This is a very good thing because you are never going to get better than that, which means this was essentially the best case scenario. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have a lot of information about him and his beliefs. It's like, what did we get from Prevost? He voted for Trump and he's registered Republican. Now, being registered Republican obviously doesn't make you a good, like it doesn't mean that you are on the right side of every issue, because the Republicans are not always on the right side of every issue. But it does mean, like, if he were registered Democrat, then that would just mean that he was part of a party that I consider to be straight up evil. So he's not that, right? He voted for Trump. That means he probably values life issues very highly, based on other things he said, right? Has he criticized Vance? Sure. As John C. Wright put it, a cardinal politely disagreeing with the vice president on an issue, and as it so happens, the vice president was correct on this issue, which was about like the order of charity, basically that you need to prioritize your own countrymen over the stranger. Just because there was a polite disagreement on this point doesn't mean that he's going to betray us and is actually a secret Marxist, right?
Right.
Like it wasn't like he went out and goes like, Vance is an evil man, like we can't support men like Trump. He voted for Trump. So we're not going to get everything we want from this guy, right? Like if you want him to, and I'm going to talk about like very briefly, but the Catholic specific things, if you want him to overturn Traditiones Custodes, which is the document that banned the Latin Mass in many places, he's not going to do that, right? He's not going to overturn what's called Amoris Laetitia, which was like the document where Pope Francis permitted, and I believe he did do this. People will deny it, but I think he did do this because it was clarified in later documents. That he permitted divorced and remarried Catholics to communion. He's not going to like get rid of that,
No,
because it's going to be basically it would cause a fight, and he's trying to avoid causing a fight. He's not going to overturn Traditiones Custodes. That's going to remain the law of the land while he's in. He's not going to overturn Fiducia Supplicans, which was the really weirdly worded document where it's like you can bless gay couples but not gay unions, right? Which is like
if they're standing next to each other.
Yeah, which is like it's really weird. And what does that mean? He's not going to overturn any of that. So you're not going to get everything you want from this guy, right? But with all of that said, I don't think he's going to actively make things worse, and in some ways he is going to make things better. There are clear signs of difference. One of them is his reputation. He is supposed to be a very careful writer and speaker. This is a massive contrast from Francis, who positively bragged about the fact that he was not a careful writer and speaker. He's like, we got to make a mess, like, and that was literally a quote from Francis. Like, people have to make a mess, and he would give like these impromptu interviews where he would say stuff that just sounded absolutely batshit.
I didn't realize.
I remember there was like a Babylon.
Actually,
there was like a Babylon Bee that was like Vatican handlers drag Pope Francis away as he opines about cats going to heaven. And it was like, yeah, sure, cats probably can go to heaven. He goes, you could see like, and then he goes, the Cardinals are dragging him into the Pope mobile.
That's pretty good.
But yeah, he's not gonna. I don't think we're gonna see nearly as much of that stuff with Prevost, right? So that's already a huge improvement over Francis. I think
probably why he was chosen, frankly.
Yes,
from what you're saying.
He's considered like the thing to me that is good about this is that he was considered by the conservative cardinals, including Burke, right? Like, and Syrah, he was considered a compromise candidate. That they considered him like, people go, oh, but he was like in Pope Francis' administration, but there's like mixed things with this, right? Like, yes, he was in charge of picking the bishops. Like that was his role in Pope Francis' administration. But even though this is a very powerful role comparatively, when you actually look into the amount of power that this person has, it's less than you think. Like, yes, he's in charge of appointing and dismissing bishops, but under the Pope, right? Like, the Pope makes the decision, he enforces it, and he gives advice that the Pope then needs to confirm, So people would criticize him for like, oh, they shouldn't have gotten rid of like Bishop Strickland was a controversial one. And it's like, he was the guy in when they got rid of Strickland. Well, yeah, the Pope told him to do it. Of course he did. Like, he wasn't going to disobey the Pope. and various things. Like, it's really hard to know what his positions are. Like, as somebody pointed out, he was high up in the Francis administration. That means Francis trusts him to some degree. However, he very rarely spoke about the hot button issues, which is probably a sign that he didn't always agree with Francis on these issues. Like, that's why he didn't say anything. The fact that he was able to get along with Francis while also probably not agreeing on a lot of these issues is a really good sign. The other good sign is, as Caitlin says in here, he came out wearing the traditional vestments. Basically, Pope Francis walked out. He wasn't wearing any of like the traditional papal regalia. And this guy, Prevost, Leo the 14th, I should call him by his papal name now, right? Leo was. Right? Leo the 14th was wearing the traditional vestments when he came out. This is a sign of continuity with the tradition of the church, which is really what you want to see.
Right.
It's small, it's subtle, and doesn't prove anything, but Francis didn't do this. Like, he notably did not do this pointedly. It's no surprise. I respect the authority of Pope Francis. I acknowledge him as the head of the Catholic Church, and I do not think that the arguments that he wasn't holding any water. But I think Francis is going to go down and be remembered as a historically terrible pope. I think like people will make arguments like, oh, you know, if you think he's the worst pope ever, you don't know history. I follow like papal historians like Eric Ibarra. He literally wrote like a 700-page book on the papacy in the early church. And he pointed out that considering all of the controversies that have come out under Francis' pontificate, that would in fact make him one of the worst popes ever. Dr. Edward Fazer pointed out that Honorius was excommunicated for saying something that could potentially be misinterpreted as heretical, and he was condemned in multiple ecumenical councils and by future popes. They said Francis has, best case scenario, said way more confusing and potentially scandalous things on way more occasions than Honorius.
Oh my goodness.
Which is like, yeah, it's pretty inarguable, isn't it? You know. So no, I don't think it's like, it's one of those things people try and be cute. It's like, oh, well, you know, in the long history of the church, we've had worse popes. That's a historical question. Have we had worse popes? Possibly, debatably. I'll hear the argument.
Like the one that was running a whorehouse out of the Vatican, supposedly.
Or the guy who bought the papacy, sold it, and then regretted it, so led an army to take it back. But
yes,
that dude was bad.
There's probably been worse popes than Francis. However,
but the flip side is, so what? Like, maybe historically he wasn't the worst pope, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a really bad pope. like
he might be the worst pope in your lifetime. It would
I
be
hope
kind
so.
of scary that if there were worse popes.
Because I hope he was. Or I hope he is.
Even though I have already sworn horrid enmity with this Chicagoan Antichrist and his slatternly deep dish pizza. Disgusting.
I like Uno's occasionally.
Anthony. You must understand, Anthony. Chicago, in St. Louis, he's going to come to St. Louis probably. He's probably going to come to St. Louis.
I could go for some Unos every now and then.
Bringing his Chicago stench with him.
Oh, man, when that actually is a good thing. Like, I just realized Pope is going to visit America, and it's going to be wild.
That's true.
If he comes to New York or Philadelphia, I might have to go and see him. Because that's in driving distance.
Well, the reason why I said St. Louis is because of the basilica we happen to have.
Yeah, that's true.
And other things besides.
But yeah, so overall, no, I think Francis was a terrible pope. Obviously, I do not think that he did irreparable damage to the Catholic Church because as a Catholic, I functionally don't think that such a thing would be even theoretically possible. And if it did, if I did think it would happen, then that would be a falsification of the church, and I'm still here. So clearly, I don't think that happened, right? Like, with that said, I think he was real bad. Do I think he was a bad person? Do I think he was like a manifest heretic, like a formal heretic? I would say on both counts, I am not qualified to judge, and so abstain from the question. Um,
Hmm.
so that's and I am explicitly and openly dodging the question because I think it would be dangerous for me as a layperson to respond to such a question. Uh,
Right. Like, all we can say is this seems bad. Pachamama was a
right.
disaster for the church. And I'm not just talking the Catholic Church. For every Christian, Pachamama was just a bad time, bad
Yes.
taste.
And I've
We,
seen again many arguments are like, no, it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but like this goes back to what Dr. Fazer pointed out when he said like Honorius was condemned by multiple ecumenical councils and future popes for saying in a letter to someone something that was probably misinterpreted as heretical, right?
mm,
Like, okay, was Pachamama actually heretical? I mean, like, I guess maybe sort of you could make the argument it wasn't, even if I'm not totally convinced by your argument.
well,
But
I
was it
wouldn't, yeah,
really scandalous? Yes.
yes.
Like, extremely so. Way more than anything Honorius did. So, Uh, overall, I guess what I would say is Krevos is very much like, for obvious reasons, we need to wait and see. He hasn't done anything yet. I think there is much reason for optimism. He took the name because of Rerum Novarum, which was Pope Leo. He said he admired Pope Leo the 13th. And Pope Leo the 13th and he mentioned Rerum Novarum, which is his most famous encyclical, which is an encyclical where he basically talks against what I would call excesses of capitalism and socialism. Rerum Novarum is about like the Catholic position on these issues, and it was like in defense of the working man and against excesses of capitalism and socialism. To be clear, my position on capitalism is that capitalism is functionally morally neutral,
Yes.
and needs to be, and the only time that it can be immoral or considered as such is when it is abused, whereas socialism is inherently immoral. So they are two different categories of thing. Like
Mm,
capitalism is just the workings of the market, right? And what they are. I think that the workings of the market are not morally neutral. They're being run by interested parties. And so I don't think that saying that we need to have like no limits at any point is correct. That's the libertarian position. Uh,
right.
I'm not a libertarian. And that's because, like, even though it's the workings of the market is run by people and people have interests. So clearly, corporations can abuse their power. This is self evident. With that said,
Yeah.
with that said, there is a difference between potential for abuse in capitalism and the necessity of abuse in socialism, which is an inherently problematic philosophy. Rerum
Mm-hmm.
Novarum talks about this. So the fact that he referenced Pope Leo the 13th, who was a very good pope, and Rerum Novarum is notable. Pope Leo the 13th also wrote the famous St. Michael prayer. Fun fact. Uh, so
Oh,
I
very
think there
nice.
is cause for optimism with Leo the 14th. You get like people like Vox Day who are like, oh, he's a liberal from Chicago. I mean, sort of, but also no. Like the thing about Vox Day is that I've said this before. My discomfort with Vox Day, you are allowed, and especially with Prost, like you can have any opinion on the Pope that you want. You could think he is a horrible person, a horrible theologian, a horrible leader. You could say that you have no respect for him and that you think that he even is the Antichrist or whatever, right? And I would just be like, well, yeah, you're not Catholic anyway, so whatever. What I don't really appreciate that Vox does is he starts spreading around like, oh well, the fake Pope just died. And I'm like, I don't really appreciate that because even though he did like link to a debate later, I know Vox enough and read him enough to know that he basically based that on nothing. Like he just based that on I really don't like the Pope, and then he found someone later. It's like, oh,
Well,
there's
no,
this
no.
conspiracy theory.
There were some decent conspiracy theories about Pope Benedict. The
There
question is
were,
that,
but I was following what Vox was saying. His whole thing with the
oh
fake Pope is that he was like You're correct there. Where now the conspiracy theories, to be clear, I do think in this case they were quite wrong. And my argument that Pope Francis is a valid pope is very, very simple. It's an ABC syllogism. Premise one: the only body that is eligible to decide who is a valid pope is the College of Cardinals. Premise two: the College of Cardinals considered Francis to be the valid pope. Premise three: therefore Francis is the valid pope. Like, I don't
fair.
really think that I've heard some of the conspiracy theories. I don't think they hold any water. The fact of the matter is that Benedict himself referred to Francis as the Pope. There have been resignations of popes in the past. People were trying to point to like ambiguities in some of the phrasing that Benedict used, but to be frank, the ambiguities were not there. It was a really tortured reading of stuff that he said that caused the ambiguities. The fact is, the College of Cardinals decided on Francis as the Pope. Francis was the Pope.
Well, yeah, but just to be clear, the conspiracy theory said that the Lavender Mafia essentially threatened Benedict into compliance.
There were multiple conspiracy. I'm talking about probably the ones I saw used by like the most scholarly, like traditionalist folks. Although it would often be combined with like the Lavender, the reason that it wasn't he didn't really leave was like the Lavender Mafia. And then they would say, oh, but he left under duress. And there is this obscure code in the obscure canon in the medieval code that says you can't leave under duress, which in the end, it's all like functionally the College of Cardinals made their decision and Benedict accepted it. So whatever reason that he left for, it's over. Yeah. Like it's done with.
Yeah,
and even more than that, Benedict, if you didn't think Francis was valid, well, guess what? Benedict died. So Benedict's dead and Francis is dead and the new pope's been elected. Like that is what it is. So yes, with that said, like what bothers me sometimes with what Vox does is that he would go like, oh, it's the fake Pope Francis. If he had said it's the evil Pope Francis, the Marxist Pope Francis, the terrible Pope Francis, or even like the Antichrist Pope Francis, I would have basically just been
good, rotten Pope thing.
I legitimately would not have cared. I wouldn't even have gone on my radar. It's like you can have whatever opinion you want about somebody who is explicitly not your spiritual leader anyway, right? Like you could it's that he was calling him a fake pope. I'm like, now hold on, like that's not your call to make. You're not even Catholic. You do not get to decide or have an opinion on if he's a real or fake pope. And then later Vox would like link to be like, oh, they had a debate on this. It's like, no, you were not like following the debates and then said, wow, I can't believe that this obscure medieval canon was contradicted by Benedict's resignation. No, you saw he was like Marxist and then, or whatever, in your opinion. And then you said it's a fake pope because a real pope wouldn't do that. But that's not how the Catholic Church works. It's never been how the Catholic Church worked. It's just it's a different type of structure. Which gets on to the subject, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the subject is, of course, a structure and sort of authority of the church. And I don't mean the authority of Protestant versus Catholic churches. As far as I'm concerned, Christ is king. No, I'm talking about, how do I want to put it? Like the choosing of authority. In contrast, right? I'm gonna step off the Pope for a second. The worm, the Chicagoan worm, deep dish pizza. So most Protestant churches have either a denomination that they apply to, for example, Lutheran, Pentecostal, Baptists, that have an authority structure, not Baptist as much, but certainly Lutherans and Pentecostals, Presbyterians, they have a relatively strong Catholic culture sort of rip-off thing to them. Like in Catholicism, the churches don't really own the land most of the time that the church is set on. Most of the time, the land is owned by the head denomination church thing. The authority, I'm just going to call it the authority of the church. The authority of the church owns the land. these people tend to have constitutions they follow that is given to them, specifically given to them, including up to messages, what's hymns to sing, a bunch of stuff, depending on how strict it is. And then they essentially, it all flows from that. Uh, Oftentimes they're stuck with the people they get. For example, the Lutheran Synod has been absolute garbage. They have made a travesty of things about like homosexual marriage, female priests.
Are you there? Oh no, Ben. So Ben's not talking. Therefore, I'm going to need to entertain the crowd here. So Ben is talking about how the Protestant Church authority is set up and run. I want to check my volume to make sure I'm not talking over him. Cool. Okay, I was double checking to make sure that we really couldn't hear Ben, and we can't. So sorry for the moment of silence there. Uh, yeah, I cannot speak to how Protestant churches are set up and how their authority is structured. So while Ben is figuring out why we can't hear him, I will speak to the Catholic side of things. So obviously, the Catholic Church is a very old institution that has roots going back to the first century. Yeah, Ben is explaining that. Keeps giving him errors. Caitlin points out that some Protestant
Oh,
churches. Ben, yay,
I'm
you're
back.
here. I'll let you finish your point before I get into the Catholics then, since you've gotten back in time. Caitlin says some Protestant churches make their pastors' insurance help pay for abortions. She's right. The Lutherans do this. I know because I was talking to a former Lutheran pastor who converted because for this reason. They made his health insurance paid for abortions. Anyway,
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, I talked about that. I was talking about that when my mic failed. I'm not quite sure why that happened. It started working again a minute later, after I closed down Cookie Clicker, which is a great sacrifice. I hope you guys understand. Me turning off Cookie Clicker for even a moment, even a moment. Um,
So
so
many cookies unmade.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, uh, so things like the Lutheran Church have their synod, usually, which this is what I was talking about then when I conked out. Basically, they have a top-down authority that makes it so that they have to choose the choices that the authority wants. For example, their health insurance pays for abortions. The female priests, pro-homosexual marriage, stuff like that. Right? Gays in their authority structure. There was an odious fellow who once dated my sister and later turned homosexual. He was very cruel to her later on. He ran the children's thing for the Lutheran Synod for many years and is now a gay activist. How in God's good name did they just let him in? I assume that there's homosex at the highest levels of Lutheran society. However, I want to promise you all that if Luther knew even a hint of what this would be, he would write things so based, so unpublishable that homosexuals would burst into fire upon touching the books themselves. Because if Martin Luther had any skill, it was his rhetorical viciousness. Um, so you have that sort of problem, right? Uh, then you have There's some medium churches out there, smaller groups. Usually they're kind of cults, certain Pentecostal types and stuff like that, and they have a kind of mix. There's not real. They look mostly like low church, but they're actually a bit more organized. Mormons are kind of in this category, even though they want to be a high church, and they usually have some ownership of churches, some aren't, a bunch of independent ones. Then below them, in the true low church category, you have organizations like the IFCA, which aren't necessarily a governing body for church, but rather a loose. This is Independent Fundamentalist Churches of America or something, and it's kind of a loose brotherhood, of helping each other, making sure pastors have an authority that they can appeal to, providing examples for one another. It's more about self-help. Anyone can leave at any time, and there's no problems. There's probably a problem if they leave. You know what I mean? But there isn't any. How do I want to put it? Like if a Lutheran church wants to leave the Lutheran Synod for its many homosex issues, they would basically lose the land the church is on, at the very least. I'm not talking about pastor salaries, licenses, any number of things, sacraments, sacramental. I don't know how you call it. Like lose your baptism, essentially, depending excommunication, as well. Any number of things can happen to them if they want to leave the church. In the medium churches, it's leaving the cult. If you're no longer a snake handling Pentecostal, you don't get the benefits of being a snake handling Pentecostal. A lot of mega churches that aren't really their own denomination are kind of a part of that stuff too, by the way. Then in the IFCA, it doesn't really matter. You were an independent guy. You can come in the room. There's a board of directors that helps determine things because everyone, it's like a bunch of like landed nobles working together without having a king. That'd be a good way to put it. There's a authority in a way over everyone, but if you decide you don't want it, you can just leave. So the next level down is the one that's actually very important, and that's the church constitution. Now, it is my understanding that all churches have a constitution, and it's mostly in America, and it's mostly a legal document stating the rules and bylaws of the church. It's how it handles the taxes, because again, money is changing hands with tithes. Therefore, the government either has to have its own tithe or not. What it does, who's a part of it, what is the standards for membership. Even though you'd think this would be highly politicized, in actuality, it's as simple as having a form you fill in. It's almost weirdly easy to just shove whatever you want into it, and then have it accepted. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody who checks to make sure that a church actually meets there at certain times, and has members. But that's different from what some people kind of think of it. So recently, my church wanted to. I'm not going to talk specifically about it because I want to make sure Anthony and I have relatively even time. Church wanted to make some changes to the Constitution. As we all know, the culture war has been getting hotter. So rather than having some things that would be, shall we say, up in the air and easy to change should a bad pastor come in and sway the flock, they want to put it into the Constitution ironclad. The three of them being simply no homo marriage, and your whatever gender your sex you were born into, so no trannies either. No, what's the other one? No long. How do I want to put it? Short Earth creationism, essentially. The world isn't millions and millions and billions and trillions of eventually years old. God made it exactly how he said he made it. And even though the Bishop Hunger might not be right, there is like a definite time limit to the Earth's existence. This isn't like a scientific document. We're not looking at things and saying, oh, well, if you look at the carbon dating, no, it's like we reject these sciences, supposed sciences, and just simply say that the creation happened as God said it happened. No more, no less. 6 days, literally. And lastly, some membership stuff that's not really important, more points of order than anything else, but necessary to have because it keeps things slim in a way, keeps things very specific. So they followed essentially normal constitutional proceedings, getting changes to the Constitution. And it passed with a vote except for 2 people. Everyone approved it except for 2. Nobody knows who that is. It was an anonymous vote. The deacons took care of it with the worship pastor overseeing, all out in the open. They didn't stuff any ballots, shoved my ballot into a basket, which was then counted, so on and so forth. And you might say, well, that's what, it's just a piece of paper. Well, the thing is that, one, constitutions have to be enforced by people. And there is an ability to create a new constitution within the corpse of an old church. I'm not going to say it's easy. And if there's question of ownership, things could get really hairy. But essentially, the Constitution needs to be enforced by people. It's the same with the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States does not enforce itself. It's the same with the church's ones. For example, we left a church, old church, before we came to our current one. I wandered around way before then, but my mother finally said enough's enough after the pastor had a Christmas pageant with the music director, who was like an odious but quiet fellow, dress up like an elf and prance around on stage. It was bad. It was really, really bad. Guess what? They followed the constitutional order. My family voted against the dude. Why did we vote against the dude? Because we knew he was bad news. We could smell the stench on him. He couldn't answer questions like, could you name a couple, 4 things that, that the youth, blah, 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 blah. I chose a weird number to throw him off. But like every pastor I've ever known has had a heart for the youth, who's good, a good pastor, that sort of thing. There was nothing to do for it. The Constitution didn't protect, couldn't protect us. And because we weren't anywhere near the majority, we had to leave the church. So, for Catholics, it's impossible in a way. You can go to a different parish. Maybe the priest will be better there. But from what I understand, most of the priests are running off of the same clock of, subjects. If I'm recalling correctly, is that right? Like, they're given is it like every year a schedule or something like that?
What's the question? I'm sorry.
That's fine. So from what, whenever we go to Chincoteague, right, that heretical priest who does not believe in the miracle of the feeding of the 4,000 seemed to always preach on that every time I've been there.
Oh yeah. So what you're asking is like the schedule of readings?
Yes. So
yes, there is a repeating. So it would be around the same time each year. Yes. Technically, it's like a 3-year schedule, but it's a little bit more complicated than that because we have feasts that happen every year and feast days each year. And then we repeat readings on the feast days. And this is like, we always go to Chincoteague around the Feast of the Assumption. Yeah. And that's a prominent enough, it's also in the gospel and it's a very prominent story. So
the Assumption?
It comes up. Not the Assumption, the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah. I was about to say.
Yeah, no, even I wouldn't claim the Assumption was in the Gospels.
uh,
Although that would be a pretty funny thing to have. It's like, where's the assumption? Just with a chat, someone with the chat face. Then you go, no, where's the assumption? Right here, Luke. And then you just go, that has nothing to do with the assumption. And then everybody's high fiving him in the background.
right. Yeah, so that
But
is
no,
exactly what
no, I
happened.
would not claim that.
But yeah, so like, it's a different, there's like, at this point, it's been 500 years. There are so many differences between a low church Protestant and a high church Catholic that the interactions, are in the commonality between a priest and a pastor. Both the priest and the pastor, if they're doing their jobs, should be the shepherds of their flock. There's just more authority over that priest than there is over the average pastor, low church pastor. So that's kind of how things go. Like, since I'll go over this really quickly, and then I'll let Anthony sort of take over how they choose a new pope. Um, Within reason anyway.
Yes.
So like, if let's say that we have a church that doesn't have a pastor, usually one of the elders takes over, reads, and since he's usually not a trained pastor, does his best to explicate the scriptures, extricate the meaning of the scripture he's read. He might read from a devotional. He might just read a few chapters, and then we sing a bunch of hymns. Usually what happens is, because churches are in organizations like the IFCA, low churches, usually they can call out to either a local Bible college, their alliance, or even find somebody in retirement to come up and preach until such a time as they find an official pastor.
Where are you at? Sorry, I'm looking at a document on the Pope actually in the background to prepare for my part. So if you were asking me something, that's what I was doing. Oh no. Nope, he wasn't asking me something. His microphone just died again. Uh Womp womp. Technical issues day, friends. All right. That's fine. Yes, I was actually reading up on for in preparation for my part of what's going on with Pope Leo. So I'm gonna try and avoid calling him Prevost because his name is now Pope Leo the 14th. Prevost is his former name. His papal name is the name that we should be calling him. Ben was reaching near to the end of his talk, so we will we'll move on to my bit. So here's the thing about the election of the popes and the authority structure of the Catholic Church generally. It is, I'm trying to think of how to put this exactly. The Catholic Church is very, very old. It has undergone a lot of changes in how new popes are elected. If you agree with the Catholic claim that the election of candidates comes from the Bible, we see in the Council of Jerusalem the first election of an official in the church, and it is done by lots. The precedent this sets, so how is Catholicism like, why don't we pick candidates by lots? Well, the precedent this sets is that the bishops or the leaders in the church are allowed to come up with the method of election. The apostles at the time chose lots. Hello, Ben. But it was then eventually changed to a vote among the bishops, right? Over the course of many, many, many years and many, many controversies. If you, at the end, even if you do not accept the Council of Jerusalem as being in continuity with the Catholic councils, that is nevertheless how the apostolic succession is kind of justified, how the election process is justified by going, okay, so. Oh no, it says I'm speaking. Let me check on YouTube to see if I'm actually speaking. Yes, I am coming through on YouTube.
What is going on?
Hold on. I checked. All right, so anyway, yeah, when it comes to the way that the Catholics pick candidates for the papacy and cardinals and things, right? Uh, what you need to understand is that we're basing this authority to choose our new officials biblically. So, biblically, we say, all right, in the Council of Jerusalem, they picked using lots, but now we have decided to change the method to a vote among the bishops and then eventually among the cardinals, right? Which are bishops who are appointed to special positions in the Vatican and have a higher range of authority. So, we have these councils, and what happens after the death of a pope, or in the case of Benedict XVI, after the resignation of a pope, we have the funeral, and then the cardinals are brought in from all around the world. There is a voting limit, somewhere in the high 70s. I don't remember exactly. However, cardinals who can't vote can't, like, an age limit for voting is what I mean. It's somewhere in the high 70s, I think, maybe 80s. But the voting limit ends. You can still attend the council even if your voting limit has ended, is what I'm trying to say. So you will have cardinals there who can't actually vote, even if you have cardinals, even though most of the cardinals there are going to be able to vote. So it's pretty interesting when you see every new election for a pope. The College of Cardinals is often very, very different. Ben, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. I must
Yeah,
apologize.
I was speaking because I checked YouTube and I was coming through on YouTube.
Yeah, I must apologize. I insulted my computer in the previous stream, and the machine spirit is mad at me. This may sound like a joke. It is actually not a joke, and I would like to publicly apologize to my computer for demeaning it when it has given me 6 to 7 years of fantastic service. Anyway, please continue.
You can. Okay, so you'd prefer if you were nearing the end of your thing, so you'd prefer if I just continued with what I was going on. Yeah, I was discussing how.
I'll bring it back up later.
Sure. I was discussing how popes were elected. So, just to summarize where we're at, I was saying that the roots of the electoral process come from the Council of Jerusalem. And I point out that even if you do not accept, this is in Acts of the Apostles, even if you do not accept the Council of Jerusalem as being in continuity with the Catholic Church, that doesn't really matter, because nevertheless, we would say, like, we're rooting it in that, you know what I mean? Like, we would say, this is where we're getting it from. You go, well, I don't think it's in continuity. Okay, that's fine. Maybe it's not in continuity. Like, obviously, I would think it is, and you don't, which is fine. But we are still saying, like, we're modeling it off of the Council of Jerusalem. In the Council of Jerusalem, they picked with lots. So you go, well, why don't we pick with lots? The reason is the way that they justify this is they go, well, what we see in the Council of Jerusalem is that they decided the method for picking new members of church offices. Therefore, we have the right to decide our method, and eventually, summarizing thousands of years of history, much controversy, and emperor interventions from the Eastern Roman Empire, as well as Charlemagne and all of this stuff. Eventually, it becomes a vote among the bishops, and then the sometimes are called, like, the princes of the church, the cardinals, which are like, a cardinal is not its own order. A bishop is the highest order in the church in terms of, like, a sacramental order. What a cardinal is a bishop who has been given some form of extra responsibility. There might be, I'm actually going to check this. What is the definition of a church cardinal? Because I've never actually looked into this. I just know you can be appointed a cardinal.
And to be clear, to you and to others, like, the issue of Catholic authority, church authority over, say, Protestants is not in necessarily how they choose the Pope. Like, it's fundamentally, choosing by lot. That worked for, like, this is going to be weird coming from a hardline, Bible's right Protestant. But, like, what they had was an organization of people right there in one city, or maybe, one city in the surrounding towns of Judea. Very small movement at that point. you also had 12 people roaming around, 13 at a certain point, who had interacted directly with Jesus Christ. It is perfectly reasonable for them, being Jews, to fall back on their, ways of determining God's will. That is not necessarily what we need at this time, partially because, not that I don't want to say God is doesn't speak or anything like that, but God kind of intends for us to follow his will without rolling dice, I guess. It's kind of weird. Like, we're not supposed to be hucksters, looking at every cloud or something like that, like it's a sign.
Yeah, I would agree with that more or less. Like the basically the justification became like, well, they chose their method of, like it was the apostles chose their method of picking a successor. Therefore, we have the right to choose our method. And the method they eventually, after much time, came up with was what we have today, right? The vote of the College of Cardinals. So, by the way, a cardinal is simply an advisor to the Pope officially. They're the most senior, so they're the most senior positions in the Catholic Church. They are not a separate order of bishops. Like a cardinal is just a bishop, right? There is no, even a pope is just a bishop. Like there is no like super bishop where you're a.
So
It's not a separate order in the church. There is no sacrament involved in either becoming a pope or a cardinal.
sure. So, like, just to be clear, they're not like over the archbishops.
So the answer is yes and no. They have because they're advisors to the Pope. So if the Pope is the person who chooses the cardinals, right? Directly, the Pope chooses the cardinals. This is why that's honestly, arguably, the single most important job of the Pope, which is weird to say, right? But think of
No,
it as like,
it's reasonable.
yeah, think of it as saying like, what is the most important thing that Donald Trump has done? It's picked the conservative Supreme Court, right? Which is what I would argue. I would say that whatever flaws that Donald Trump has, we owe him a debt simply for creating a court that would overturn Roe v. Wade, right? Now, you could argue if that's actually the most important thing he did, but certainly, like, it's not an unreasonable position to take. It's the same thing here, right? Like, believe it or not, because cardinals elect the new pope, appointing new cardinals is very, very important for the future and history of the church. And in each election, like the College of Cardinals can be radically different, because they tend to be very old and they die off, and then the new pope elects new ones. So even like 5 years down the line, you might have a College of Cardinals where it's only like, only 5 people in this election or something voted in the last college, right? So it can change very quickly. Going into the history of it, this is the justification for the vote of the cardinals. They are advisors to the Pope. They are not like, or there is no ordination to be a cardinal, so that you don't get any extra sacramental graces. Some of them are like an archbishop is just a bishop over an archdiocese, which is just a collection of dioceses, just like a diocese is a collection of parishes or churches. So an archbishop is just the guy in charge of the archdiocese, just as the bishop is the one in charge of the diocese. Cardinals can be archbishops. They are not over archbishops in that sense. Like, they're not over it, like, this is my boss, the cardinal. No, like, the cardinal might be an archbishop. In the case of Leo the 14th, he was actually the prior of I believe, or he was the leader of a group called the Augustinian Priors. I'm actually going to double check my terminology. Basically, there was a religious order known as the Augustinians, who root obviously back to St. Augustine. And he was the leader of the order. So that's already a very prominent position. They were a large religious order. He was their leader. He was a bishop. And then Pope Francis appointed him a cardinal only 2 years ago. He was made a cardinal very recently. And then he was made the head of the Vatican office for appointing new bishops. So he had a very, very fast rise in the church, and he was probably not, from what I was reading, he was probably not Francis's first choice, but we'll discuss that later. This is more about the process of electing the Pope and like how that works. So the way that the College of Cardinals works is that there is an age limit, so not all cardinals can vote, but they can be present at the conclave. I don't know exactly what it is, either high 70s or 80s. Like, just to give you an idea of what that means, Leo the 14th is 69, and he is considered a very young pope. So, make of that what you will as well. We just actually had, in fact, we just had like 3 very long papal reigns. John Paul II is like, I think, the 3rd longest ever. He reigned for an extremely long time. Benedict the 16th actually reigned for quite a long time. His and if he had reigned till death, it would have been comparable to John Paul II. And Francis also reigned. What was that?
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Well, he didn't reign till death, so like it's just hypothetical. Yeah. And Francis also reigned for quite a long time for a pope. Like, you have to understand that historically this is not the norm. There was the year of 3 popes, which was also not the norm, but does, like, it's happened, right? John Paul II was himself elected after John Paul I died in like 1 month. He just got sick and died. And then John Paul II was elected to replace him. And he was a very young pope when he was elected, but he was like not the, he was not the pick that they wanted. They kind of needed to compromise after John Paul I's death. So, yeah, these sorts of things happen.
That, but I know that's not the subject.
I haven't researched it, so I won't except very, very like cursory research. So I wouldn't have much to add. Anyway, with the subject, like what happens in the conclave? The movie Conclave is not accurate. It was hilarious to see people going, cardinals are watching Conclave so that they know what goes on in the conclave. Like, no, they weren't. Stop lying. That's not what happened. I did hilariously see the Pope's brother said before they went to the conclave, they did watch the movie Conclave, but I don't think it was because he wanted to learn what happened in the conclave. I think it was just his family having fun. Like, hey, you're actually going to be in a conclave. Let's watch the movie with that title. It's
if I was a warlord, rolling through St. Louis streets as I do, I would watch Mad Max films unironically.
Yeah. Conclave is a piece of anti-Catholic trash. It's absolute garbage. It's literally about like how all of the corrupt churchmen are lobbying for power, but one man throws his support behind a tranny pope so that they can get a woman's touch. Oh, you think I'm kidding? This is the real plot of Conclave.
See, I have never actually bothered to look at anything of the Conclave because, as any astute watcher will know, even though I don't talk about it a lot, I am a Protestant.
Yes. No, I've only seen articles on it, and from people I trust who have watched it. Like, the movie is absolute trash. Like, it's an evil film. It paints the whole process as like these conniving, scheming cardinals who all want, and then when you actually talk to people who are part of the conclave, they say what it basically is like a 2-day retreat where it's mostly just intense prayer followed by voting. There is almost certainly like very little time for them to even be doing this sort of backroom politicking. That's not to say that it doesn't happen. I am sure it does. There are human beings involved, and we know for a fact it did, like, say, back in the Middle Ages, But what I am saying is I think that there is a lot of cynicism surrounding the idea that, hey, wait a minute, maybe these people actually believe in the things they say they believe in. Surely not. But no, I do think that probably most of the cardinals, to be frank, are actually sincere about their beliefs. It's also like a well-known thing in the papacy. I just saw a video on this, but I knew about it before the video. Popes infamously historically do not want to be pope for the most part. I can only think of a couple popes who actually wanted to be pope, and they have very bad reputations. Uh, the only off the top of my head, Alexander the Sixth. That's the famous Borgia pope. You know, the one who had who had like mistresses and children and whatever. He does not have a good reputation. He really wanted to be pope. And if there is one good thing you can say about Alexander the Sixth, and I am being quite sincere about this, I'm not mocking him, it's that he did seem to take the job very seriously. Like he understood the weight of the responsibility, and yes, he did want to be pope, but it's not like he didn't consider it, like he was using it for some other reason. You know what I mean?
Using it for his son's wars.
Oh yeah, like don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Alexander the Sixth was a good pope. He was very much not.
Okay.
I'm not arguing in favor of him. What I am saying about Alexander the Sixth is, as much as he is worthy of criticism, and he is, it does seem like he believed in the papacy. Let me put it that way. Like, sure. For all of his flaws, I do think that he legitimately believed that the papacy was what he said it was. Like, it wasn't just a cynical power position to him. Like, it really was a religious position. That doesn't make him a good pope, nor does it make him an honest pope. But at the very least, I do think he grasped the weight of it. Right. So this is like, he's the only one I can think of off the top of my head who I know for a fact actually wanted to be pope, and he has a really bad reputation. I know Benedict IX wanted to be pope because he went to war to get the papacy back, and nobody likes him. So yeah, most popes don't want to be pope. I think Benedict XVI famously hated being pope. He literally resigned. John Paul II did not want to be pope. I know Pope Gregory the Great, there are several homilies and letters that he wrote to various bishops where he calls being pope like this great curse or something. We have not checked. Pope Leo XIV has not given his opinion on the subject yet. So I suppose we shall see. But I would be very surprised if he actually was lobbying for Pope. The way that his brother talks about it is they were quite shocked that he became Pope. So I highly doubt it was on his bingo card. Yeah. It wasn't on the list of things that he was angling for. So, it's a very different thing. Yeah, it's a conclave is a very different thing than what Hollywood would like you to believe. There are, even when it comes to people like Francis, as I've said, speaking as a Catholic, I do not feel qualified to judge the personal qualities of Pope Francis, basically judge the state of his soul, nor do I feel qualified to state that he was an actual manifest heretic, as opposed to what would be called there's technical terminology for this. Basically that he said heretical things, but he perhaps was being unclear, or he might have meant something different in his head that he did not say. That did not mean he was all sorts of technical stuff, right? I don't feel qualified to judge that. I'm not going to judge that. I can only judge on the things that he actually said, and that I have seen. And I do not think that he made good decisions as Pope. With that said, Pope Francis did not go into the conclave as a favorite to be Pope. There is so much speculation on a lavender mafia and whatever, but the big problem with all of this is, as plausible as it is, and it is plausible, I'm not going to pretend that it's not, 100%. I mean, the fact that there's a lavender mafia at all is basically fact, right? But the influence of it, the fact of the matter is, it is conjecture. It has to be conjecture because conclaves are secret. All of these things that you hear from the media about oh, there were factions in the conclave or whatever, these are essentially illegal leaks. Immoral prelates are going to the press anonymously, and going yeah, this is the skinny. Either that or they're making it up.
Right. I mean,
Which
if I were, running one of these things, I'd have like 3 different rumor mongers, all claiming 5 different popes, fist fights,
that would be
whatever
pretty
will,
funny.
it's like we have a highly placed source in the Vatican, and it's some shit poster I paid on the internet, to, pretend he's there.
It reminds me of some memes I've seen that's like it's like, that like the way that Bruce Wayne gets people to stop thinking that Bruce Wayne is Batman is that he posts as a conspiracy theorist on like Reddit, constantly spamming that Bruce Wayne is Batman with terrible arguments.
Right, right.
Like he goes, no, look, their ass is the same, and just like zooming in on the suit, and then someone going, come on, dude. And it's incredibly effective.
Then an internet schizophrenic puts it together because paparazzi follow Bruce Wayne around all the time. Every time that Bruce Wayne does squats at the gym, this account posts how good the ass looks.
It's like, how did he know?
He's right.
No.
How did he know?
No.
Sorry,
This is completely off topic now, but I did find that meme funny, and it is in character even for Batman, as I've seen him in various versions. So it's amusing to me. It would be a pretty clever way to keep people off your trail, just to shit post about yourself so that you just look like a lunatic.
Right,
It's
right.
like, no, guys, Bruce Wayne's Batman. I know, because the bat ass matches. And then they go, guys, shut up. It's like, no, look, there, and they go, look, Bruce, Bat, B, and then people are like, get away. I am now so far off topic, but I'm going to mention this very briefly. Honestly, it's kind of funny to me that more people did not figure out Bruce Wayne was Batman, because if you think about it, he's like the only person who possibly could be Batman. Yeah. Like, what resource? Who else would have the resources?
I assume that more people have figured it out than not. It's just that, one, they're scared of his resources, and two, it's like, he saved me from the Joker yesterday. We're pretty mad he won't just kill the clown. But, at the same time,
he saved my life. He saved my life. Well, like, as weird as it sounds with all of the memes about Superman, it is more plausible to me that more people don't know who Superman is, because Clark Kent's just some guy, right? Like, he's just a reporter. Why would you suspect it was Clark Kent? Like, and Superman himself, like, his powers don't depend on any pre-existing structure being in place that you can investigate. He's just like, and his powers are also powerful enough that Clark Kent is constantly able to give himself plausible deniability. Like, basically that he can move so fast that it would be impossible for Clark Kent and Superman to both be in these two places, so he could give himself alibis, which is what he does, in fact, in story. All right, the tangent over. I just found that amusing. Anyway, yeah, what I was going to say is when you hear these things about the Conclave, you need to take all of it with a major grain of salt, right? Because we just simply do not know. And they're not allowed to talk about it. That's not to say that they don't talk about it. Obviously, you have hundreds of cardinals, and some of them are going to be power hungry, because that's human nature. Like, they will talk about it, but they're not supposed to.
Right.
So at least they can only talk about it in a very limited way. Like, in terms of, do we know that the Lavender Mafia came together to get Francis elected? I mean, here is what I think is more likely to have happened. Francis was simply not that well known. His name had come up beforehand. There is a rumor that, like, oh, Francis came out of completely nowhere. Just like Krivos, this isn't exactly true. The thing about Leo the 14th and his election is that he was considered a low odds candidate, but only for one reason. He was actually like an incredibly good candidate, except he was American.
Right.
Like, I literally watched Joe Heschenmeyer, like, before he linked, he's a Catholic apologist, and he was talking on a show, like, who are the candidates? And he mentions Krivos, and he go, And they go, he's actually a great candidate. They go, what do you think his chances are of being elected? He goes, probably in the single digits because he's American. But he goes over, like, as far as his qualifications go, he is, like, unbelievably well qualified. Like, he's done missionary work, speaks multiple languages, has been in the Vatican in very high-ranking positions, gets along with conservatives and liberals. Like, he was a fantastic candidate. Would have probably been a favorite, except for the fact that he was American. Francis was a little bit similar. There were people, it was not true that Francis came absolutely out of nowhere. I was following the election at the time, like all Catholics. I went to a Catholic school. So even, especially then, like, this was the talk, right? Fond memories of being after school and going like, oh, they announced the new pope, and we all crowded around the laptop to see what was going on. And it's not that Jorge Bergoglio, which is Francis's former name, it's not like he was well known. He wasn't, but he had come up as a possibility. I think the reason he was elected is, yes, I do think that the leftist Cardinals really wanted him, but I don't know if it was like a lavender mafia threatening people so much as they managed to convince people that he would be a compromise pick. Because, to be honest, that's always what you're going for, right? In these conclaves.
Yeah.
You're always going to go for a compromise pick. It will always be somebody who will make the most amount of people happy, the least amount of people unhappy. Hardliners almost never get elected. Favorites almost never get elected. One of the few times a favorite was elected was Benedict XVI, actually. Joseph Ratzinger was like a very much a favorite, maybe not the favorite, I don't remember. But he was very well known going into the conclave. He was like the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Basically, he was like the theologian in chief of the Vatican when he was elected. Almost as high a ranking position as you could possibly have besides Pope. So Benedict XVI was extremely well known when he became Pope. Krivas was a bit of a mystery, right? Because sure, he was the head of a religious order. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, he was in front of the crowds constantly, and he was constantly writing to the press. So it was probably easier to sell him as a bit of a, as a compromise. When it came to Francis, I think it was just he was in South America. He was a missionary. Argentina had a lot of Marxism. And Francis was definitely like, he was on the side of the church against the Marxists, but then it kind of came, and I think they were kind of selling that like, well, he's not Marxist, he's on the side of the church. But then it kind of came out later that he was like cozying up with the government in some ways. And you could argue that this was honestly justified in certain cases, and you could argue it wasn't. But nevertheless, these are a lot of nuances that I think they were just kind of able to gloss over in the conclave.
Yeah. And it's the thing is that like Argentina is not like it is one of the most corrupt places you can possibly go to, even though it's a nice corrupt place compared to like other corrupt places you can go to. It's like I don't know what people expect, quite frankly, with third world dictatorships.
Well, sure, it's like China is extremely corrupt, but it's a great place to visit as a tourist. They treat tourists very well. Because they know that if they don't, it will be a huge scandal, which is the one thing the Chinese really do not want.
Yep.
The Chinese just really want to look good. So they treat their tourists like gold. That doesn't mean that the country isn't unbelievably corrupt. It is. Argentina is in that boat. It's a very, very, very corrupt country. Probably more corrupt than China, to be honest with you. Which is saying something.
Even with guys like, is it Bolsonaro? What's the name of their current? God, I can't remember.
I do not know. Doing okay?
No, Bolsonaro was the guy who failed in Brazil. Excuse me.
When it came to Francis, if I had to guess on what was going on and how he got elected, it's honestly just that the Lavender Mafia was managed to sell him as a compromise pick, but he wasn't. Like they just managed to get away with one, right? So, in what way did they do this? I think it was because they wanted a missionary pope, and Francis very much was that. And he did, to be fair to him, emphasize this during his papacy.
Mhm.
But they wanted a missionary pope, and Francis very much was a missionary pope. And I think they were able to sell, like, yeah, he was in, communist Argentina, but he was a part of the Catholic Church, and they persecute Catholics there, and he protected priests, and this is true. This is very much true. Like,
Mhm.
he absolutely did do that. I'm not saying it wasn't true. But then it like came out later that he might have had, like, in order to do this, he had to make certain like agreements with the government, that things might not have been entirely on the up and up. I am not accusing Francis of necessarily like selling out to the government, but what I am saying is that the whole situation was way more complex than it first appears, and there was a lot more going on there. So I'm also, by the way, I should say for the record, because it makes it sound like I'm calling Pope Francis a Marxist, which is something like Razor Fists will do, like you have a Marxist Pope. I don't know if I would concede that.
No, sure.
Uh, I don't think he would qualify as. I'm not sure if he would qualify as Marxist. Like, I saw there was a pretty good analysis. Like, he issued an encyclical on climate change called Laudato Si, and someone goes like, "Well, what's the issue with the encyclical? Is there an issue with the encyclical?" And the answer is, theologically, it's fairly sound. Like, maybe a little more flowery about the environment than I would expect, but it's not like we're not supposed to treat the environment well. Tolkien was very pro environment, and you really can't get more conservative than J.R.R. Tolkien.
You can't.
Uh,
I don't know if it's possible.
no, it's not. Uh, it really isn't. So, and he's like as pro environment as they come. So, what's the actual issue with Laudato Si? The actual issue is that the encyclical is about care for the environment with the assumption that global warming is real,
Mm.
basically. And this is not an assumption that I would grant.
Yeah. So
Um,
let's
and it colors
sorry.
the entire encyclical as a result. It's like we should be doing these things under the assumption that we're on the verge of some sort of massive ecological disaster, that is inevitably going to come. And I'm like, no, none of that's true. So all of the advice that you gave is kind of colored by this, and it sort of ruins the encyclical.
So let's actually talk about that briefly. Like when a Protestant pastor, generally, in low churches especially, comes to the pulpit, he'll give he might make some changes to how he likes to do the service. For example, my pastor doesn't necessarily like to do altar calls or to pass the plate around. He basically says, "Hey, look, here's the website where you can give your tithe. God does expect a tithe as worship, but I'm not going to make you do it." Like I'm not. It's not like the Church of Discount Sin, which famously has them like holding a gun to the congregation because they didn't give enough the first time round. It's a great joke. 10 out of 10 if you haven't seen it. So like when it comes to the Pope, what changes could let's say the priest expect?
So with a new pope, the thing is that it's kind of weird. Whenever Benedict spoke about this, in fact, a lot of popes speak about this. When they give advice, a lot of the advice amounts to don't expect to change as much as you want to.
Right.
This is kind of one of the reasons that Francis's papacy was so disruptive, right? Is that he changed more than people expected. What could the average priest expect? The truth is, generally, very little. You pray for the Pope in the Mass, so you say a new name, right? Like, that's pretty much it. But then you get into, like, what did Pope Francis do versus Pope Benedict? Okay, so we had Vatican II. We're getting into a little bit of history here. Sorry. They issue a document. The document is called Summorum Pontificum. If you read the document, basically it calls for a series of common sense reforms to the liturgy. These are incredibly uncontroversial reforms. Like, basic things, hey, it might have gone a little bit too ornate. Maybe you could use English at more, or, the vernacular language, I should say, at more points. Maybe, be careful about picking the music, stuff like get the people more involved, stuff like that. Extremely boilerplate. Not even the most strident traditionalists that I have spoken to anyway. I'm sure you'll find some crazies out there, but not even the most strident traditionalists, or most of them, will have a problem with Summorum Pontificum, right? It's just common sense liturgical reform. So what do you expect as a result of this? Well, the Latin Church has its Latin Mass. It's now known as like the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass. It's but the missal of that mass, which is like the instructions, the rubrics for saying it, come from 1962. So we'll call it the 1962 missal. People were expecting some sort of reform of the 1962 missal, just common sense stuff to update it, right? Well, when Paul VI was in office and he was implementing Vatican II, that is not what he did. He appointed a cardinal. There are wild rumors that this cardinal was actually like a secret Freemason, and that Paul VI figured this out later, but it was too late, and that's why he assigned him to be like the cardinal of Iran or something, which had very few Christians. I read a pretty interesting article on this. They said, to be honest, the scarier thing here is that we don't really have very good evidence that he was a Freemason. He might have just been a well-meaning bungler, which is even scarier.
Right.
They go, it's also, he might have been a Mason. I'm not saying, like, there was some legitimate smoke there, but there was no fire that was ever uncovered, is how I would put it.
Sure.
This was a guy named Bugini, so a literal bug man, which is hilarious. Anyway, he was put in charge of reforming it. He did not reform it. Instead, he came up with an entirely new mass. It is known to this day as the Novus Ordo, the new form of the mass. And he did not give like any time for people to adjust, like, okay, we're going to have a rollout period or whatever. He just completely said, this is the norm of the church now. This is what we're doing. Every parish do this. Paul VI did promulgate it. He did improve it, but like, I've read some things on it, and it turned into like he was shocked by what happened, but now he was like in too deep, and it was like way too late. He couldn't really do much about it, so he just kind of tried to do the best he could with it. Okay, so the Novus Ordo becomes the norm, and you get this massive like liturgical watering down of the mass. Now, I will say this. A Novus Ordo properly said can be extremely reverent, and I've been to such masses. For one thing, for example, even in the Novus Ordo itself, there are instructions like that Latin is still the language of the church. You should be using Latin in the mass. A lot of there are Novus Ordos that are done like mostly in Latin, with only certain parts done in English. Also, they'll be they will also say, like, Gregorian chant is the official music of the church. This is what is said in Summorum Pontificum, right? Remember that document?
Sure, yes.
In Summorum Pontificum, it says Gregorian chant is the official music of the church and has pride of place in the liturgy. It also says certain hymns in a respectful way can be used. Well, in the Novus Ordo, Gregorian chant has been almost completely removed, and it's been replaced by like vague worship music, and a lot of it Protestant, which is my own personal pet peeve. I complain about it often. I love Amazing Grace. It is a very nice song. I think it is lovely. My aunt sang it at my other aunt's funeral. It was beautiful. Everybody cried. It should not be in a Catholic mass.
You're a crying I will never forget, Jack, Anthony. You're a crying Jack.
I am. It's sad. I will always remember, though, when I went to a mass at the Blue Army Shrine to Our Lady of Fatima, the priest got up and he goes, all right, and for communion, we will be singing on Eagle's Wings. And then he laughed and said, just kidding. Brother Pius hates that song. And I said, I like this guy. And he's right, by the way. Eagle's Wings is pablum. But It's lame, Hillsong. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is, you get a very watered down form of the Mass. They did add an Old Testament reading to the liturgy, which was not there previously. They would just read from the New Testament. However, as has been pointed out, if you actually go through like the rubrics of the liturgy, most of the biblical references and like the biblical quotations essentially have been stripped from the Mass. The thing is that they used to be like woven into the entire Mass. Like as the priest was speaking, he was constantly quoting parts of the Bible. Most of that had been removed, which is like really sad. And this was all done intentionally. It was intentionally meant to mimic Protestant liturgies with the stated goal of bringing in more Protestants who would be more used to it. Obviously, this was like a catastrophic failure. And if you think about it, this would make sense, right? Because if you want to convert to Catholicism, like you're a Protestant who's investigating Catholicism, the entire point is that you're converting to Catholicism. If you wanted to go to a Protestant liturgy, you would just go to a Protestant liturgy. So it's sort of like the Hank Hill meme where he goes, "Don't you get it? You're not making with the Christian rock group. You're not making Christianity better. You're just making rock worse." It's kind of the same thing here, where it's like you're not making Catholicism better. You're just making Protestantism worse. Like it's just a watered down Protestant liturgy that's some weird hybrid. And also the other problem is that even though it can be said beautifully, like with the norms in Latin and all sorts of traditional things, it can also be abused really, really easily. And there was a period of time in like the 60s and 70s where like this was the norm, and you get the meme of like clown masses, and this was like a thing for a time. Now it is much, much better nowadays, I will say. Even that, like when I go to most churches today, most of them are just like rather boring and uninspired liturgies, but there's nothing like unorthodox about them, right? They're just kind of uninspired, I would say that the liturgy in Chincoteague is more or less like this. I wouldn't say it's done in a disrespect. I'm not talking about the homily.
Okay.
Like we'll leave that aside. As I could tell, that's what you're thinking of. Like, but when I talk about like the liturgy itself, it's said in a perfectly normal way, just like bland and uninspired.
Yes.
Like,
which, to be fair, has been my experience with Catholic homilies from my first visitation. I don't even think there was a homily the first time I was there, or if there was one, it was I wasn't able to understand that it was happening.
yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, and also one thing that needs to be remembered, and that is kind of part of the problem, the centerpiece of the Catholic Mass and the centerpiece of I should say, an evangelical Protestant service, because you need to be very specific. There are very many different types of Protestants, right? Are very different. The centerpiece of the Catholic Mass is and always was the Eucharist. There are two parts of the Catholic Mass: the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. The liturgy of the Word is the first and less important part of the Mass. It's actually in Catholic rule, like instructions to priests, that homilies are not meant to be that long. They're meant to go like 20 minutes. That doesn't mean they're not supposed to be substantive or good or meaningful. They're supposed to preach on the scripture that was read at the Mass, but they are not meant to be particularly long because they are not the point of the Mass.
Right.
The point of the Mass is the liturgy of the Eucharist. This is a fundamental difference. So it becomes this big thing where like you can go to, and this is one of the big differences with a Novus Ordo and a traditional Latin Mass, right? If you go to a traditional Latin Mass, they do have a homily, like 100%. Like that, the liturgy of the Word is still a part of a traditional Latin Mass. It's just done differently. But the entire Mass is quite beautiful. And to be frank, like the strength of the speaker in the homily is less important. Because they try to Protestantize the Novus Ordo in that way, if you have a boring homily, it almost kind of ruins the Mass, right? Like the whole Mass sort of becomes boring because the homily becomes so important to it, because it's being done in a way like Protestants would do it, when that was never the point before. You could have a relatively boring homily and a beautiful experience at Mass because the entire rest of the Mass was beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. This history is all very important for what I'm going to talk about and why Francis became so hated by, like, and I will say hated. I would say I didn't hate him. I was very because I just didn't like. I didn't have any feelings of hatred, right?
Sure.
But I was disappointed by him. I would say, though, there was a lot of hatred towards Francis among traditionalists. So it's important to talk about, like, but why? What did he do? All of this background is very important. So Benedict XVI comes in. The traditional Latin Mass is all but eliminated. It's said in certain religious communities and basically nowhere else. Well, Benedict XVI realizes that a lot of people were very hurt by the introduction of the Novus Ordo. But he also realizes that reversing it completely and just going back to the Latin Mass immediately would probably cause a lot of harm, because a lot of people now have grown up with the Novus Ordo. It's become their regular Mass. And a lot of people do have fond memories of it. And after all, it can be said in a respectful and beautiful way. I've been to such Masses. I think the Novus Ordo Easter Vigil is quite beautiful. In a lot of ways, there are good points to it. So you can't just like reverse it immediately. You'd almost be causing the same problem, right? You'd be alienating a massive group of people who are like, this was my Mass. Not only that, the traditional Latin Mass is now the minority. So Benedict XVI does a sort of compromise position, right? He releases a document called Summorum Pontificum. And Summorum Pontificum was a very important document. It basically said, if a parishioner asks for a Latin Mass to be said in their diocese, you have to comply. That was Summorum Pontificum. That was like Benedict XVI's compromise position. It did not make the traditional Latin Mass like the standard. It did not make it a requirement. It did not even make it common. They were still relatively rare. But if somebody wanted a Latin Mass, if parishioners approached a priest and said, we would like a Latin Mass, then you could not turn them down. You would then like go to the bishop, and the bishop would make arrangements, and then, something would be done. Right? This is the long and short of it with Summorum Pontificum. It led to this huge outgrowth, like relatively huge. It was still a minority compared to the Novus Ordo, but a huge outburst of Latin Masses that I had been like, I visited one for the first time only a few years ago. Like, it's not like I regularly went to a Latin Mass. And the one thing I noticed that shocked me is that it was the first Mass I had ever been to that wasn't on like a special day, like not a First Communion or Christmas or Easter. It was just like a random day in the middle of winter that they ran out of parking and I had to stand at the back of the church.
Oh, wow.
Like, I had never seen that before. Never. Only in the Latin Mass. So it shocked me, and it was quite beautiful. And the first time I went, I was like very impressed. It was extremely beautiful. Lots of Gregorian chant, which is absolutely gorgeous when done correctly. A lot more silence than in the Novus Ordo. The people are expected to do less. That's one of the big changes that like the Novus Ordo was meant to change. Like, it incorporates the people more in responses. Well, in the traditional Latin Mass, there's a lot more silence. It's the priest talking more and the people talking less. But I found it quite beautiful. So this was like the big thing, like, all right, the Latin Mass, it's slow, but we're slowly building up communities, right? And people have found a place for themselves. Then Benedict XVI resigns. Summorum Pontificum is the law of the land. Well, what does Francis do? He issues a document called Traditiones Custodes. Traditiones Custodes is a nasty document. Basically, he says there is a schismatic mindset coming out of traditional Latin Mass communities. Is he right? Probably sometimes. Right? Like, there are certainly people like that, but is this going to be true of the vast majority of people in these communities? No. Well, you get there's some obnoxious online voices who are like, yeah, the Novus Ordo is invalid. You need to come to the TLM. Don't go to the Novus Ordo. That's the fake church, right?
Right.
These sorts of voices would pop up and were loud. In my experience, they are very much not the majority. I was going like when I first visited a Latin Mass, it was after Francis had issued Traditioniones Custodes, and they didn't talk about it. Like they would say pray for the Pope. They called Martin Luther the arch heretic, which amused me, and I appreciated it. This was only in passing in the homily.
Sure.
They just, but they would say pray for the Pope, and they said also pray for our order. The reason they were still around is that they were like an order of priests specifically dedicated to the Latin Mass, and they were worried there were going to be some sort of knock-on effects against their order. As it turned out, there was not, because the order handled it very well. They basically, after the document was issued, they immediately went to Rome and said, we want it in writing that you're not going to touch us. And they got it very quickly, so it ended up working out. But yeah, like hundreds and hundreds of dioceses. What Traditionis Custodes did is basically say, effective immediately, if you have a Latin Mass in your diocese, like it's being shut down. Yeah. And he did say it is in the purview. He goes, it's in the purview of the bishop if they want to keep it going. Some bishops did, some bishops didn't. Right. Like they said the norm is that it's shut down. If a bishop wants to keep it going, they're permitted. So there were dioceses where the bishops did keep it running. In fact, I believe this is notable. This might be a rumor, but I heard this from someone that the current Pope Leo XIV did not shut down Latin Masses in his diocese. So make of that what you will. But there are like places like in Detroit, in Chicago, like massive communities were like closed overnight. You know, he gave them no time to prepare either. It's like you got 1 month, or something like that. It might have even been effective immediately, and they just had to scramble and figure something out. So this is the main reason that the conservative, if you're wondering like what was going on there, that's why the conservatives absolutely hated Pope Francis.
And it's a good.
If you want my personal, go ahead.
And it's a good look into what like a pope can do when they come into power. We'll say it sounds like how soon after his arrival to papacy did he create the document you were discussing?
It was it was a few years in, and it was a shock, by the way. Like, people did not like, they already didn't like Pope Francis. So the other things that you were mentioning, like what could a pope do? That's something he could do. Reason I talked about all of that with all of that background is because that's what he could do with a boots on the ground level, right? Like, what could he do that would affect you in the moment? Something like this. And even this, by the way, most Catholics were not affected, because most Catholics don't go to a traditional Latin Mass, right? They just go to a Novus Ordo anyway, so it simply wouldn't matter to them. And not all traditional Latin Masses were shut down. Like, the one that I'm getting married in is a traditional Latin Mass. Why are they still running? Well, remember I mentioned there were those religious orders that said that their specific function was saying the traditional Latin Mass, like that's why they formed, and then they got permission from Rome that he wouldn't touch them. That's is one of them. They're called the FSSP, the Fraternal Society of St. Peter. And by the way, this actually led to an actual real schism in the Catholic Church. Not Traditioniones Custodes, but the whole Mass controversy. There is a group called the Society of St. Pius X that literally is in, like, it's really weird. There's a big debate on this. I am of the opinion that they are in schism after reading a bunch of arguments on it, but people will very, very, very strongly disagree with me. It gets nasty in the Catholic sphere. So called the Society of St. Pius X. A guy named Archbishop Lefebvre, because he refused to stop saying the Latin Mass, and he ordained his own bishops in defiance of the Pope, and he was excommunicated. Like, And there are people like the SSPX are in a regular canonical status, and like it's a huge debate over like are they actually excommunicated or not. I am of the opinion that they are. The FSSP, which is the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, is in union with Rome. They are basically like, literally, they are SSPX in communion with Rome. Like, that's how I would describe it. They like basically went to Rome and said, hey, we are willing to do what you ask if we can say our Latin Mass. Is that cool? And Rome said, sure.
Okay.
Like, and that's the FSSP. And there are other societies too, like the Institute of Christ the King is another Latin Mass religious order, where like specifically they say the Latin Mass. So they weren't touched. And there were also dioceses where the bishop said, yeah, I'm not going to touch the Latin Mass. So they let them stay. But it shut down a lot of Latin masses, and it really set back, like, traditionalists were very hurt by this, I would say.
Yeah.
If you want to know other things that the Pope did that resulted in these big controversies, so forget Pachamama for a moment, because to be honest, in terms of doctrinal stuff, like that doesn't really do much. That's just scandal. Yeah. It's a very serious incident. I'm not saying that's not, but it ultimately doesn't like affect the running of the church, right? So what did he do that affected like day-to-day running? Well, he issues a document called Amoris Laetitia. I do not remember what it translates to. Something love. I don't know. The document is, again, it's a really strange document, to be honest with you. It's like 99.9% absolute boilerplate Catholic teaching. And then in a footnote, literally in a footnote, it contains this absolutely massive change in church praxis.
Right.
Where it says, like, in certain circumstances, we may consider bringing divorced and remarried Catholics to communion. And everybody freaked out, like, what the fuck does this mean?
What do you mean?
And he said, and like literally a group of cardinals got together and issued a dubia to the Vatican, which he did eventually respond to, like in piecemeal after several years. He seemed to be determined for a very long time, and pretty much the entire time. Like, he avoided talking about it. He just refused to clarify what this meant. So people were like, so wait, can divorced and remarried Catholics take communion now? So again, this is like important point. What do we mean by this? Well, this goes back to St. Paul. He says, like, if you eat and drink communion unworthily, you eat and drink judgment on yourself, right? So you're not supposed to have communion in a state of mortal sin. Even then, priests will not deny basically anyone communion. Thomas Aquinas even talks about this. Like, why was Judas permitted to receive communion? He actually discusses this. And his conclusion is because he was not in manifest sin. In other words, he was not publicly sinning in a way that the other people there could tell. Jesus knew, but he wasn't causing scandal because the other apostles didn't know. The point here is to avoid scandal. So what we would say is, if you are in mortal sin, you receive communion, you shouldn't, but you're only hurting yourself.
Sure.
So the difference with divorce, yeah, like we'll tell you, you shouldn't do that, but we're not going to turn you down even if the priest knows about it, because other parishioners don't necessarily know about it, and you're only hurting yourself. But there is an exception here, and the exception is if you are in public sin. What would a public sin be? It would be if you're divorced and remarried, right? Because the Catholic Church is very clear on this. If you are divorced and remarried, you're committing adultery under the Catholic paradigm. So that's a public sin. A priest can forbid you communion. They could also forbid communion if you do something like, say, publicly support abortion. This is why there are the controversies, like will the bishops give communion, stop, Nancy Pelosi from going to communion. And then most of the time they chicken out and don't do it, which is frankly disappointing. But occasionally you'll see it come up where they go like, oh, ex-politician is barred from communion. It will happen occasionally. It should happen more, but it will happen occasionally. And the difference between them and, like, let's say I don't know, I steal something, right? I stole from the till and I don't confess it. Well, nobody knows that I stole something. I know. I shouldn't receive communion.
Right.
Maybe the priest knows. Maybe he learned about it from someone. But if he still is required to give me communion because the public does not know about it, I am not publicly sinning.
Right. Because
I'm not committing scandal.
sure. Like it's one of those things where it would literally be, hey, look, I can't stop you, but God knows and he sees your heart.
Right. And you're eating and drinking judgment on yourself,
Mm-hmm.
by eating this unworthily. So this is the big thing. It has been like it is a well-known, like it's a Catholic chestnut. If you are divorced and remarried, you can't receive communion. And it's the result of much controversy, by the way. Literally in my own family, this has been like my grandmother was a devout Catholic, got divorced under mysterious circumstances. Very mysterious. There's like probably one person alive who even knows the full story of what happened there. Anyway, she couldn't go to communion, and it like really hurt her and eventually led her to leaving the Catholic Church. So barring like debates on if this is the right or wrong thing to do, it has simply been the praxis for basically as long as the Catholic Church has existed and has talked about this. There's been like no change on this.
Mm-hmm.
Divorced and remarried Catholics have been barred from communion under the very, very clear principle that this is a public sin that causes scandal. So, okay. He drops it in this footnote. And everybody explodes, and he does nothing. Clarifies absolutely nothing. Well, eventually, it was discovered that there was, in fact, a clarification issued. A document issued in Buenos Aires, basically in response to the questions. And this started popping up in the Catholic sphere, the discussions, right? And the qualification was basically, in certain circumstances, you are like under the discretion of the priest, you can potentially admit divorced and remarried Catholics to communion. Like basically the way that it appeared to read is in fact the way it was supposed to be read. And then you go, okay, what the fuck? Because then you're like, so what? Then what about what you were saying about scandal? Like, what are the implications of this? None of this is discussed, right? Like, none of it is discussed.
Right.
To be clear, this is not a change in doctrine, right? Like, no doctrine has been changed. It is a change in discipline, because we could always, like, it's always been known that somebody in grave sin, that even the priest knew was in grave sin, could at times be given communion. So, like, that is always been like a part of Catholic praxis, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the particular skin of scandal has historically not been allowed. But then it goes like, okay, in this case, scandal being allowed, like, does this mean that there's now been a change to the idea of like scandal? Is it only in this circumstance? Why does it only apply to this circumstance? None of this is discussed. None of this is talked about. It appears to not even have entered his mind as bringing up an issue. If I had to guess the logic of it, you can have like, of course, there's like the conspiracy theory, like, well, because he's trying to destroy the church. Like, really, he's trying to with extremely subtle theological changes in footnotes in documents. I am maybe, but I think that's implausible. I think it's more likely that Pope Francis was like, no, I'm going to be the merciful Pope, and they're in a very hard situation. So I'm going to say that you got to use discretion when you decide, right? And I understand this, right? I do get it. My grandmother would have appreciated this. The problem with it is the theological can of worms it opens that he seems to just not have considered, right? Like, what it raises so many questions. And maybe you can make this sort of change in praxis if you're willing to point by point go through all of the theological questions that arise. But it's like he took a hammer to a massive thing, and it's big, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why the fuck would you do this?
So
Yeah.
let's so that's a pretty good explanation. Like I understand it. Our listeners are definitely understand it. Our many Catholic listeners somehow. So, uh, uh, so let's talk a bit about if Leo has done anything.
Okay, so let's discuss Leo a little bit more. We discussed the person of Leo before. He was quoted as a compromise candidate, backed by some of the more liberal and some of the more conservative cardinals. However, it does look like all indications are that he is not another Francis in terms of his praxis. Here's the thing about Francis. His theology, as weird as it sounds, was more or less orthodox. Like, even when you get to like some of the weird edge cases where you go like, oh, like what he said that there were other ways to Christ to a group of school children. Yeah, I had a problem with that too. I didn't like it. But also, like, he said it in a conversation with school children. He didn't actually change any Catholic theology. In none of his documents did he make any like sweeping heretical declarations in Catholic theology. At best, there were points that he was incorrect or that you could disagree with. You get what I'm saying? Like, there's a distinction here, if that makes
Yes.
sense. Or am I
No,
confusing
no,
you?
I understood. He was saying something
Okay.
nice, if heretical. Believe you me, plenty of old ladies have done that
Right.
in my own churches.
I have a serious problem with it, and I have never been convinced by arguments people have made that it wasn't actually heretical.
Mm,
It is possible, again, that like he might have misspoken interiorly, he might have meant something different, or he might have regretted it in the way he said it in the aftermath, or he might have only been emphasizing a certain point. All sorts of things. Nevertheless, I think that the comment as it stood was heretical. Um, Okay. So with that said, like this is I'm referring to like, oh, there are many, just like there are many languages that can say the same thing, many religions can reach Christ or something like that. Um it's not really important. It doesn't matter because my point is he wasn't in this moment like expressing some sort of massive change in Catholic teaching or practice. You know, he was just talking to some school kids, right? As weird as it sounds, Francis's theology, especially in terms of his teaching office, was not really the problem, right? The bigger problem was the way that he handled the office. Like, to be blunt, you're not supposed to make the sorts of changes that he made, right? Like, compare Summorum Pontificum and Traditiones Custodes. Summorum Pontificum didn't really change anything for the average Catholic. If you wanted to keep going to your Novus Ordo, you absolutely could. And Benedict XVI would have no issue with that. But Francis makes a massive change to the way that Catholics act. Similarly with like Amoris Laetitia, you know, in terms of communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, like you're not supposed to make changes like that in footnotes with no clarification. Like, that's not how it's supposed to work. These things are supposed to follow a process. And Francis is not doing that. He's not respecting, like, the tradition of the office or the church. And it's leading to major problems. So, even if you could say that Leo XIV is theologically similar to Francis, I think the bigger and more important change is that he's supposed to be a very careful speaker and writer. Like, that alone is almost the polar opposite of Francis by his own admission. Like, Francis says himself, he's not a careful speaker and writer. If Leo XIV is a careful speaker and writer, like, that is an enormous difference from Pope Francis. So, what do I actually expect him to do? I think he is going to leave most of what Francis did alone. I think he's simply not going to make a lot of changes. I don't think he's going to overturn anything. However, I don't think we're going to see him like continuing to move things in a more leftist direction.
Right.
So the flip side of this is like you got the issues with the German bishops and the Synod of Synodality and whatever and all of that nonsense, right?
What a name.
Like, Yeah, absolutely nonsensical name. It's a synod on synods. Like what the fuck? Um like that whole thing was an absolute disaster. And I will say, even with the caveat that in the end it was basically a tempest in a teapot, but that just makes it even more of a disaster, because what was even the point? Like, you create all of this. That's kind of the Francis pontificate in a nutshell, right? Like, you create all of this confusion, cause all of this scandal, have these heretical bishops constantly talking, and then what comes out of it is virtually nothing.
Yeah.
Like,
Except
so, like,
you've distressed your flock.
yes, except for, yeah, you've distressed your flock. So, um, I think that Prevost is not going to. He's not going to do anything like that. I think the way he handles the synod on synodality is essentially going to be like he's going to say, "All right, that was very nice. Now let's move on." Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I think when it comes to the hot button issues, what we're going to see is that he's going to be a lot more concerned with than Francis about interpreting things in like continuity with the church.
Hmm.
Right? Like, that's going to be his big goal. That he's going to try and interpret it a lot more in continuity with the church. He's going to be a lot more careful about doing so. So when someone comes up to him and says, "Hey, what do we do about the next big controversial issue? Female deacons is like a thing that people have kept bringing up." I think he's going to say no.
Yeah.
I think we're going to, if we see anything from him, it's going to be a no. I think he's going to disappoint a lot of conservatives who are hoping that he's going to like overturn some of what Francis did. I don't think he's going to do that, because I think he's going to want to keep the peace, and he's going to want to maintain some sort of continuity. Now, this is a big problem, because Francis represented in many ways that I've described such a break that continuity is going to be very difficult. And by the way, and for the record, you might think that the way I'm talking, that I think like, oh, Benedict the 16th was such a great pope. I don't think Benedict the 16th was a great pope by any stretch of the imagination. I think he was quite a disappointing pope. I think that he was theologically conservative, and he was a brilliant theologian. And by the way, I think he was a good man who tried, right? Like, I don't think that he was a bad pope in the sense of like he was a bad person who meant to do bad things. But I think ultimately he managed to do very little to stem the tide. He was a disappointment in a lot of ways. Summorum Pontificum was like his most enduring legacy, and his successor overturned it. Which is, like, that's the most he was able to accomplish as pope for the church. He actually probably did more for the church as the head of the CDF, like the head theologian, than he did as pope.
Yeah.
But yeah, when it comes to Leo the 14th, if I had to guess what was going to happen, I think when it comes to female deacons, he's going to give a firm no. He's going to say, like, it's simply not in continuity with the tradition of the church, therefore it cannot happen. I think when it comes to things like the Latin Mass, he's going to maintain the status quo, but he is not going to crack down on the Latin Mass in any way.
Sure.
In fact, the Mass was just said in Latin in Rome, like, today. And a lot of the traditionalists are extremely heartened by this, when they were formerly very suspicious of Leo, because he was in Francis's administration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to be very suspicious. But he just said the Mass in Latin in Rome today for the first time since the Francis pontificate. And this has heartened a lot of the conservative cardinals, and a lot of the traditionalists. So I think he's going to be much more positive towards traditionalists in the Latin Mass. And I think we will see some growth there, which is good to hear. But I think mostly, like, as weird as this is to say, being a compromise candidate means that you're simply not going to see a whole lot of change. I think my expectation with the papacy of Leo the 14th is that it's going to be quite similar to the papacy of Benedict the 16th, in the sense that, to be honest, Benedict didn't really do that much.
Yeah.
Like, what his big thing was Summorum Pontificum, and Summorum Pontificum was great, but if you followed my whole line of logic, it was in the end kind of a compromised document. Like, we might see more compromised documents of that sort from Leo the 14th. Like, for example, if they come up to him and ask him to resolve the dispute with a Maurice Letitia, I suspect what he is going to do is say that it's going to be something like a case by case basis. I think you're going to be very hard pressed to see him expressly go, Francis was wrong. Like, he's not going to do
Right.
that. But what you will see is, I think, in future documents that he does issue, like when he does issue his own encyclicals, they're going to lean in a more conservative direction. Not necessarily because he is a more conservative pope in the sense of like, oh, he wants to bring back all of the old traditions of the church and bring back the TLM and ban the Novus Ordo. But more so because he is very cognizant of writing and speaking carefully, and he wants to make sure that continuity is maintained. Francis did not care about this. Expressly and openly, again, he admitted he did not care about this. But supposedly, that's the big thing, Leo the 14th does care about this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're going to see a return to something more like the Benedict the 16th and John Paul II papacies, where it's going to be relatively boilerplate Catholicism. And this is a good thing. It is much better than the alternative. If you asked me before the conclave, I expected a leftist cardinal because I thought that Francis had packed the cardinals. I think what happened this time to prevent that from happening is simply that Burke and the conservative cardinals, Dolan was another big one, who is the Archbishop of New York, were very wise to this and were like hell-bent on preventing it from happening.
Right.
So they organized. So credit to them, and I hope Leo the 14th works out. Anything you have to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to real briefly, like the part of the reason why I wondered about what he plans to do or what his first moves might be was because it's very much how do I want to put it, like when leadership changes, especially in a church, there's often a lot of bad feelings, but also it's like the ultimate decider as to whether you have a quote unquote conservative pastor or a non-conservative pastor is based on whether or not he keeps up, certain traditions, or if he decides that, certain things are important or not. And I just was very curious about that because most pastors, what they do is either come in and shake everything up, or they just don't. Maybe they change up how new the hymns are. That is generally like if you were to put money either into it, like when a new pastor comes in, he either changes the hymns or he changes something else. I don't know.
What I'm trying to get at with my impression of Leo the 14th is that I think what we're going to see is somebody who is like, I almost don't want to put it this way, but I'm going to, like, spooked at making any major changes.
Right.
Like, and that includes to the Francis, because I think he knows, like, from what I've seen, that, like, I do think that he is a person who is going to make a good faith effort. Like, and I think he knows he was picked as a compromise pope. So I think what we're going to see with him is that he really doesn't want to undermine, like, he doesn't want to take a stand on the Francis pontificate as, like,
Right.
the anti-Francis guy. And he doesn't want to rupture with the church. So you're going to see him being very cautious with his big moves.
Right. And here's the
with the synod, for example, I think what we're going to see is him politely end the synod.
Yeah.
Like, not do it in a way that is dramatic where he condemns it. He might even say, like, you'll probably see flowery language like Pope Francis's great experiment in bringing the more involvement in the church has ended and we can take its fruits with us. But I suspect he will end it. Like, but he will do it in a way that is very, outwardly respectful of Pope Francis. And when he issues documents and things, it's going to be very much to avoid showing any sort of breach with anyone, which means that's going to have to be very limited in scope.
Right. Like,
which is how most popes function.
Yeah, right. He's going to be conservative in a literal way. Not just conservative like how we would imagine it for a U.S. politician, but more in the sense of he's not going to make big waves. He's probably going to quietly shore up a bunch of damage Francis has done. Like most of the stuff that Trump did in the first 100 days and stuff like that was just repairing damage that Biden did.
Yes, and if there is one thing that we need to look out for with Leo the 14th that will tell us what his legacy will be, it's who he picks as his cardinals.
Yeah.
And that is going to be something to look out for. That will tell you if I am right to be cautiously optimistic, because I do consider my take to be cautiously optimistic. I don't. He's not going to be what conservatives wanted him to be. He is going to be disappointing to conservatives. It's going to be like, well, when is he going to overturn Traditionis Custodes? I don't think he will, because I think he probably correctly will see that as, well, then they're going to see it as me opposing Francis. And I don't want to be seen as being like the anti-Francis guy. I think he might quietly support, like Latin Mass communities. Like he'll say, hey, if bishops are permitted, he might say something like bishops are permitted to allow them. He might encourage them. Like he might do things like have Latin masses in Rome, for example. Like he just did. But I don't think you are going to see him directly contradict a previous papal encyclical, like, frankly, Francis did, in a way that was grossly disrespectful, in my opinion, to Pope Benedict XVI. Francis couched it all in very nice language, but like that was arguably Pope Benedict's biggest legacy as Pope, and he undid it. So, you could say what you want, but I found it like highly disrespectful to the living Pope Benedict at the time.
Yes. Yeah, and there's similar things that happen in Protestant churches, especially the low church ones. What happens is that if you get a very old church, like 100 years, and I know that sounds funny, but it's like, 100-year-old, Protestant church.
I get you.
You often have a whole bunch of legacies, like memorials and stuff like that, to people who maybe they have at most one living relative at the church. You can't really get rid of them. So what you do is you hire an idiot groundskeeper like myself and tell them, hey, listen, don't make it look like you're the one cutting this stuff, or I told you, but cut it so we can put in, so we can do something with the grounds and don't have to constantly fight to have, to change how the grounds look or something like that. Ranked church politics, I'm sure it's entirely universal. As weird as it is to say, park benches, pew names, whatever you have. So then what happens is that sometimes they bring in their own music minister. Often in my church in particular, we have a certain gentleman who has been the music minister for several pastors. And it's not that he sees them come and go or he gets rid of them or anything ridiculous like that. It's just that he happens to not feel called away whenever the pastor disappears. So, so he's kind of a fixture. But many times they bring in their own music guys who, do their own music thing because it's kind of difficult to be both the pastor and the music director in many different occasions. Then usually what also happens is that a couple families, usually around 2 to 3, follow the pastor in if they happen to be in the area. If he's just moving within like a state, like say within St. Louis, right? Some people will follow the pastor. But in other cases, like my pastor came in from Iowa. He didn't really have anybody follow him until much later, who he just happened he repairs cars, and he joined a very prestigious classic car repair shop. in the area. So of course he joins in. So you have things like that. The thing is that and usually the elders stay the same. Sometimes he has to fight the elders. For example, a pastor I happen to know had to fight the elders because they had some very weird ideas. Look, let's be real. Women shouldn't vote. This is the hardline misogynist whatever thing we have. I don't read women's books unless I know them personally, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to understand
Amazing.
you have to understand. I'm saying this openly, but that guy kind of hated women and new mothers. So it's one of those things where whatever you thought about him, he kind of was a bad influence on the church, especially one that was growing and having a lot of babies. He would stand in the nursery for some awful reason. There was no reason for him to be the way he was. He just kind of was. There was never any sex scandals, I want to be clear, that the pastor knew about anyway. So it's how do I want to put it? So when people look at stuff like what the Catholics get up to, it's kind of different, because in Protestantism, the head of the church, the chief shepherd, is the pastor. In other words, is the person that's going to be seen day to day. The pastor was there quite often when my brother was dying. So on and so forth. It's hard to, how do I want to put this? It's hard to sort of get the feel of it. In reality, while the Pope may show up at his brother's death or something like that, heaven forbid that happens anytime soon, of course. He's probably not visiting the widows and orphans and the sick people as often as my pastor does. It would be impossible for him to do the administrative part and do the other parts that he has to do as Pope, and also minister to people in a direct way. The apostles talk about this. That's why they have deacons and elders. Stephen the Martyr is the big name here. So too does my church have elders and deacons. The deacons help organize things, make sure the clubs are running, the women's club and the men's club and stuff like that, as well as offer advice on, say, for example, there was talk of putting an elevator in to the church. Guess what? It didn't happen. The reason why it didn't happen is that COVID happened. Money that was earmarked for it suddenly became very much not enough money. And so they had to just kind of abandon it. And it was a very difficult 3-year process. Every church has experienced something like this, if not this. People hemmed and hawed and bad things happened. The same with, so now actually there's actually some young men in charge of the deacons. And so they're actually very active. I joked with my pastor, my mother is physically disabled and has to use a cane. And I'm like, oh, so you hate my mother, huh? You're not doing the elevator because of her, huh? And he's like, that's not, I joked with him, it wasn't that at all. He chased me around, poking me or something like that. It was very vaudeville. There's a whole lot of things that happen within the church, but I'm trying to make it clear that it's localized within the church. A guy left, the head of the deacons left the deacons, and it threw them into disarray because he was a boomer. That's the long and short of it. So what happened is that a millennial man, an older millennial, not Gen Y, took over. Everyone agreed he should do it. He's a family man in good standing. Shows up to church on time and well slept, unlike me. So great choice to do it. All of a sudden, the church is running a bit smoother on these certain matters, and it's because there was a proper changeover of power within the church from the old to the young. I believe that it was intended by God in a very direct way. The next part, of course, is what am I trying to say? The next part is that if the pastor comes in and he has good relations with the deacons and elders, that means that he can enjoy some good peace. But in the case of the church I left, he did not have good relations with the deacons and elders. And my dad left eldership. Other people left eldership. The problem is that the Constitution, and I'm coming back to the Constitution, did not allow us to just throw the pastor out. At least in the ways that you can imagine. We could vote him in, but we would have to vote him out. And he was very popular among the people. Like I said, the only people who did not vote for him was my family, 4 people. And of course, it was very evident within like 3 weeks of the original pastor leaving that he was a bad pastor in some ways. He was actually very good at caring for people, but it's like the liberal way of caring for people. So when you look at this sort of thing, like he treated my brother very nicely and then spoke very badly about him behind his back when he left. When we left, and he's like, "Oh, I did everything for them, and they're ungrateful." And he said some things I don't even remember anymore. So you had a bad pastor. You also had no means of getting rid of him beyond leaving the church. So what has to happen, I'd say, in the most healthy low church Protestant church is that you have an independent but very spiritually adept elder council. You also have a group of, this is like, I'm just describing the ideal church, really. You also have a very active deacon board who are also, holy men. Then you have people in the church who read the scripture and just don't accept whatever the pastor slops out, and instead talks to him, interacts with him, questions him. I've questioned him. I'm going to be real. It's very difficult to square what people say about, the state of Israel and Jews and Hebrews and what prophecies there are, and with how people act, and how they say. And there's grifters, and there's Nick Fuentes, and there's, different documents about people who lie. And then there's documents about people who tell the truth. And I'm going to be real. You can't have a simple opinion about it. If somebody has a simple opinion about it, they are not interacting with the issue in any way that is godly. And God has himself, he says, he doesn't treat them different, but he makes it very clear in certain places. These are my firstborn children. It's in some of the parables that, like, for example, the prodigal son, where the elder son is generally considered to be a reference to the Jewish people. In general, resentful, unable to sort of adapt with the Father's love. Then you have things like in Revelation to the church of Pergamos, where Jesus explicitly calls any Jewish synagogue, say, that does not follow him, a synagogue of Satan. They're plain in the scripture. And he says it in other times in different places, but he says it very clearly in Revelation in a way that you can't really, sort of deny. So my pastor and I, we talked about this. We, dealt with it. I know that I can't hate the Jews. Nobody can do that. But people aren't going up to the Pope and saying, hey, I've got this issue. I know what scripture says, but I keep seeing Israeli soldiers posting dead Palestinian children, and that disgusts me on a moral level. And of course the Palestinians do the same with Israeli people too. I'm not saying that one doesn't do, his side is particularly good. I'm just saying that, someone would have spiritual issues about this. Okay, so what does the scripture say? Nobody's really going up to the Pope and saying that. What the Pope has to give out is this big announcement. Guess what? Pretty much every parish probably has an opinion about the traditional mass. Am I wrong to say that? That there's
one more time.
That every parish probably
parish
probably had an opinion about the Latin mass.
To be honest, this is going to be a little surprising, but I would suspect that most parishes didn't.
Really?
Because it simply did not affect most parishes. Like, you have to understand that the
Well,
TLM is a community that
into it too deeply. I was just
it's not deep. This is very brief. The TLM is like 1% of the church, probably maybe less.
okay.
It's growing,
Sure.
and it has popular and has very loud defenders and
It's very
of
loud.
cardinals and prelates and
It
people.
is. It is.
And there are prelates that are in favor
Yes.
of it. But the majority of churchgoers probably didn't even know about Traditionis Custodes.
Fair enough. So, okay, fine. Let me see here. What was I going to say? So, but point is that unless it's a big issue that the whole church has to deal with, I'm sure the Pope is the advisor for some people, but in general, you're not going to the Pope for your personal issues based on complex, politicking and stuff like that. The outside world or the news cycle. Well, you're going to your priest, right? In that manner, the shepherd, whoever your proper shepherd is, and then what happens is that because the shepherd has a personal relationship with you, especially in Protestant churches, which pastor could be there for generations, unironically, 20 plus years, and it's not even that unusual for some places. Usually, it seems to be about 10 years to 15 years from my experience. But that.
Yeah, I've had a priest for 20
Oh yeah,
years
me too.
before. Yeah,
Like I've gone to churches where pastors have been there like 20 years plus. I'm just saying that it's very rare to go above 25, we'll say. But that's starting to stretch it at 25. Like I've seen some, especially like church founders and stuff like that. They tend to stick with their shepherds for quite some time. But what I'm trying to say is that as with priests and stuff like that, but in Protestant churches there should be a personal relationship with your shepherd, and he guides you to a more holier relationship with God. But what happens is that if there's a corruption within the church, for example, a family that has too much power, or a bad pastor, or a bad elder board, I haven't talked about that. Well, I did briefly talk about it, but essentially, if you have a bad elder group, you could have stealing from the church. People's needs are being met. There can't be any change. They chase out young men and keep them from interacting with people in ways that is healthy, and namely finding wives and such. You have no discipleship. Brian Suave and Ben Garrett and others have mentioned very specifically that they ran into a lot of trouble early on in their ministries. These are the guys who run King's Hall and I forget their other thing, because I actually kind of like the King's Hall podcast more than their spooky podcast at this point. But basically, they would go up to older men, deacons and pastors, and say, "I believe I'm being called to ministry. Could you disciple me?" And some of them received a straight no. I don't disciple people. Now, that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. I'm not going to claim that somebody has to be an explicit teacher of men as their job description. But if somebody comes up to you and has a spiritual query that you can answer, that's discipleship too. I've done this for many, many younger men and newer Christians. I'm confused about Genesis. I don't understand the place of the Jews in here. I don't get Revelation. And then I tell them not to worry about it. Don't worry about Revelation until you've studied more. Just please. I see Joel Osteen, and he's such a hypocrite. I don't understand the Catholic thing. And it's not like I'm going to claim to know as much of a Catholic, but there have been Protestants who understand that, hey, look, I know I'm not a Catholic for this reason. I don't like their sacraments. They baptize babies. The real body and blood presence in the Eucharist, I don't believe that's accurate. and I can help them understand that, yes, so these are the scriptures you're talking about. That's discipleship. It's not that hard for a good Christian to be a good discipler. And it's not that hard for a Christian to be a good disciple too, because what you do is you take out your ego in the matter and submit yourself to it. And what I'm getting at is that if there's a healthy flow within a church, and I'm ignoring the Pope for now, but like within a parish too, if there's a healthy flow between the shepherd and his flock, what you'll have is a reciprocal relationship. The people, are stupid and evil, and they're always having issues, to the point where I actually joke with my pastor sometimes. I just take him out to lunch. Any issues, Ben? No, not really. I don't want it to be always doom and gloom with you. You can do that. You can encourage your pastor. You can encourage your shepherd. Then what happens is that if there's bad times for you, your shepherd is already going to be there for you. As part of his job description, he should. If he's not doing it, he's in error, and that's putting it lightly. My mother had a deep spiritual crisis, not necessarily like she doubted her salvation, nothing like that. But you're watching your son die. You're not going to think God's good while watching your son die. If there's somebody who can, even my dad, had to, keep a stiff upper lip with that sort of thing. And we had every confidence that my brother was going to be going to heaven. He was talking about Jesus Christ, but the pastor was there to help her through it. If he wasn't there, she would have had a much more miserable time of it. Looking back on these things, there's whatever the constitution, whatever the authority structure of a church is. If there is an imbalance in the church such that the pastor cannot do his job either through a poor constitution or, say, authority from above, not necessarily the Pope, will say, but, just in general, and can't do his duties, and then the elders aren't being the pillars of wisdom that a church should have, and then, the deacons aren't fighting to maintain the church and serving the people, and the people are willing to go along with an evil pastor and elders and everything else like that, you don't really have a church anymore. What you have is a social club where people meet for 2 hours. Doesn't matter what the constitution say, the membership bylaws. By the way, most Protestant churches have bylaws too, and it's just going over what the constitution says with more detail in legal terms, so that if somebody says, I was denied membership, I'm going to sue you, they go, no, you can't. You speak in tongues in the middle of service. We don't do that here. We deny it. It's a theological point. I'm sure Catholics have one in the Catechism. That's basically their membership bylaws, in a more general sense rather than a parish by parish sense.
I'm thinking that over. Membership bylaws, like what you're talking about is like what you would need to accept to be Catholic, or yes. So
like
there's
a member of the
this
church
is very
specifically.
systematized.
Yeah, I know it's systematized, but it's I'm just, I don't know, making sure. I guess I don't know. I was confident when I said it.
Yeah, there's a whole process for this. So let's say you're not Catholic, but you want to be, right? You would go through. It used to be called RCIA. I believe they now call it OCIA, the Order of Christian Initiation for Adults. Basically, you're educated on the basics of the Catholic faith, and then you need to make a confession of faith eventually. The confession of faith includes assent to like the Nicene Creed, as well as other doctrines. There is an official, like I've seen it. I've heard people talk about it. There is an official list. I just don't know it off the top of my head. Nicene Creed and various doctrines, and then you get baptized. If you're not baptized, if you are baptized, you get confirmed, which is another sacrament of initiation. It's like sealing with the Holy Spirit, kind of. It's how I would describe it, I guess. So yes, there is a whole process for if you want to join the church and you are not a part of it. You can't just walk in and go, I'm Catholic now.
Right. And it's a similar way with Protestants. Anyway, the where am I going with this? So the last sort of part of this is that I want to get at is that, and I was getting at as well, is that like there's the church is a living being. Uh, there's, I believe in the universal church spiritually. Uh, I believe that Anthony's my Christian brother, even though we don't go to the same church. We're just different hands on the body of the believers. Uh, I'm sorry, I just had a thought. Sometimes Catholics say there's 10,000 Protestant denominations or something, and I just had a thought of like 10,000 hands on the body of the believer. Anyway, uh, there's a certain amount of health that has to go into the Christian living, and we are called to go to church. It is not a question. It is not a debate. We're going to church. You don't get saved because you go to church, but Christ calls us to be with the body of the believers. If you're going to an unhealthy church, you really need to leave that church before something bad happens to you. And I mean this in the sense of going, if you have, let's say that you have a priest who's just a little bit interested. You wouldn't let your kid go to a public school with a public school teacher who's actively sizing your son for a dress, would you? If your priest or your pastor is a little bit interested, if you have a pastor who seems to disappear every Friday night into the red light part of town, uh, those are just obvious signs from your shepherd. If your elders seem to be really interested in that plate being passed through the pews and watch it carefully, not because of thieves per se, well, because of thieves perhaps, but not because the congregation is stealing. If your deacons seem to not do anything, or if there's any number of things, there are obvious signs for you to see within a couple weeks of you being there. There's no shame in switching off for the spiritual safety of your family, because this is important. In the same way that the shepherd of your flock is to, protect you from wolves. If Joel Osteen walks into the Vatican, he better be being lit on fire by the guard, being sent into the Vatican Guard guerrilla pits, or whatever they happen to have. If he comes into a Protestant church, he needs to be rebuked. If there's nobody who can do that and have it stick, if he's a rival rather than a spiritual danger, you have a problem. Your needs as a Christian will not be met. I am speaking from experience. That one bad pastor could speak all day and give wonderful sermons because he was a theater kid. But at the same time, when it came down to the spiritual nourishment, everyone came away anemic. And it is only by the grace of God has that church still survived into the modern day. So I'm going to go with you with it. I'm going to let you guys go with an admonishment, to take care of yourselves, to not be stupid, not to walk into it. We're called to have faith, but we're called to be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. Don't forget about the wise as serpents part. If there's obvious signs that your church is corrupt, and I don't mean, anti-Catholic propaganda. No, I mean in the serious way that whatever the Constitution says, whatever the bylaws say, it's corrupt. You're in danger, and God will basically say, look, the pastor couldn't let go of the elder's wife, while he was there, practically snogging on the pulpit. Why did you stay? What were you thinking? When the priest brought out the clown shoes and the clown nose and clown wig and started talking about letting in 1 million African immigrants. Do you think that there may have been signs that this is a spiritually dead church and your son, was not going to have a good time with that weird female Sunday school teacher, and your daughter seemed to be really interested in disappearing around. Like it's one of those things where God will basically point to it and say, there were signs. You shouldn't have gone there. This was a church meant for destruction, which, if you look at the beginning parts of Revelation, he talks about these things. This isn't like the early church where there was maybe one church per city, and deep persecution, especially in America. Like you're not persecuted at all. Like this is not, any persecution that you think you have is nothing. You can find different churches. And I'm belaboring the point because like this is sort of me talking to myself. I could have left some dead churches way before I did, and I wasted years not spiritually growing, not being fed, basically doing things I thought would please the family and the church and stuff like that. When in reality, I should have fled and found my way as God intended. And the same thing is not just applied to me, but applied spiritually to everybody. If you're not where God intends you to be, you will struggle in ways that are unfulfilling. Do not spiritually fulfill you. If you struggle against things like I struggled against the forgiveness of my father, when I was able to forgive my father, my spiritual connection to God grew by leaps and bounds. If you're going to a dead church, there's no spirit there. Not in the way that you want it to. There's a trickle, a drop of water, perhaps, just to keep you alive. But in reality, you need to seek that deep well of refreshing spring water. All right. Anything else, Anthony?
No, I have nothing else to add.
I will say from the Protestant side of things, we do wish your Pope to have a wonderful popery, but also that he proves to be a surprise and that God works mightily through him. Because heaven forbid we actually start, how do I want to put it, stepping back when in actuality we need to be pushing forward.
Yeah, no, I got nothing else. God bless Pope Leo the 14th. I hope that everything works out for him.
Absolutely. Next week, we should have the Kickstarter announcement. I'm really sorry about this. This is all on me on this particular issue. I hope that you will forgive us and enjoy it. I think you will enjoy it very much. Have a good night.